Next up, he is a local banker who is also good with a chainsaw and a tractor. Please welcome Scott McKee.
I do not want to follow Dave. Wow. But I didn't want to follow Stanley. I didn't want to follow anybody. I don't want to be up here right now. Kidding. And anybody that would see this being videotaped would say I'm a liar. Number of years ago, I walked onto a beautiful beach, and this is probably roughly 20 years ago. And it was that first trip back to the beach after a couple of years. My daughter was young. And I looked out. It was a white sand beach, and the turquoise water kind of took my breath away. It was a sunny day, the sand making that color that's only repeatable in those conditions. And it happens every time I go to the ocean. It happens to me every time I go. And I remembered back when I was younger that, tell me this, was the sky bluer when you were younger? Yes. Thank you. Points. Did the clouds seem more magnificent to you when you were younger? They did, didn't they? The grass was greener. I strained sometimes to see colors the way that I did when I was younger. And I think it's because we look at life through a little bit simpler lens before we grow. So my story is a little bit about a simpler lens and a journey back to it. I think even when you're younger, you look at relationships differently. You tend to look at fairness as opposed to privilege when you're little. The idea of privilege is something that's taught to us. And you know how upsetting it is for a child to see someone being mistreated. So it even changes our perception of the world. And as we grow, our lens gets more complex. At least mine did. So as I sat down on the beach and I had this ritual, I put the umbrella down because I can't take as much sun as my wife does, and she gets all brown and I look exactly the same when I come back. And I pull out a book, and a book that pretty much changed the trajectory of my life. And I look around at this beach and everybody looks just like me. They didn't have suits on, but they looked just exactly like me. And it wasn't just the sand that was white, everybody that was on the beach. And it was kind of a nice area. And the book that I was reading was in stark contrast to what I was seeing around me. And the author was a Christian author, and he was basically gave up everything to move to the inner city to live amongst the poor. And then as he became more and more famous, he took his life. He was in demand as a speaker. And instead of staying in a hotel, he would hightail it out of the hotel and live under the bridge with some of the homeless folks. Because of exactly what I was saying. It was a contrast. What he was talking about of helping the poor was difficult for him to go back to his nice hotel. So he would literally go camp out underneath the bridge with these folks. And it started challenging me. And as I, again, looked around and saw a lot of people that looked like me, within that book, he also talked about the fact that we really need to know the poor. We need to really know the people that are struggling. And, I came from a difficult background. I wasn't supposed to go to college. And I was kind of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of guy. I guess rugged individualism, every man for himself kind of attitude. And for a while in my life, I think that was really necessary. I think there was a period of time in your life when kind of that identity formation happens. Maybe there's some ego formation that happens. That's pretty important because you have to learn to do for yourself. You have to learn how to be productive. But left to its own, it can overtake you. And once you get to a certain point, it's easy to insulate yourself from a lot of things. You can't insulate yourself from everything, but you can insulate yourself from a lot of, you can insulate yourself from people that are on the margins. So I started back with this idea that I'm going to take on this experiment. So I ventured into a homeless shelter, and it took me a few years for me to unravel all the things that I was being challenged with, but I knew where I was going. So I started going to a homeless shelter, and I met people that just blew my mind. And every preconceived idea that I had about what causes a person to be homeless. Now, I knew mental illness could be a causal factor, and I learned that it certainly is. It certainly is. I met a guy, he was reading. The first time I sat down, he was reading, and I asked him what he was reading. He and I, Rick and I, became good friends. Philosophy and existentialism. Yeah, that kind of blew my mind. Could you explain to me what you just said? Another fellow was an engineer, a homeless engineer. He was a college-educated engineer, and the three of us would get into conversations, and it would take about 5 minutes before their conversation would go right over my head. So the experiment continued. With domestic violence victims, with victims of sexual assault, with drug addicts, recovering addicts, etc. Well, recently I took this trip to the border. I got tired of hearing the pundits telling me what to think about the immigrants that are coming to our country, so I wanted to go see them for myself. So I contacted a lady named Sister Norma Pimentel. She's in McAllen, Texas. Google her name. I've got Google Alerts set up for Norma Pimentel. She's in there all the time. I'm getting alerts all the time. She's all over the news. She's traveling the country. She has a center in McAllen, Texas, a humble little center. And on a busy day, she would see 150, 200 people. And I contacted this lady. Couldn't believe it when she picked up the phone and said, "Yes, come on down, and we'd love to have you." So I took 2 trips this year, the second one with my 19-year-old son. And I sat in her center, and we welcomed directly off of the Homeland Security buses into her center. They come, essentially, most have come across the river, surrendered, and it was determined they were eligible for amnesty hearings. And once that was determined, then they were released to Sister Norma and all of the volunteers that were there. And so we got to experience there. It dawned on me into this process that I was the first person that they would see on U.S. soil that was not law enforcement. And I took it upon myself to give them a hearty greeting. Bienvenidos a los United States, and welcome to the United States. And tears. I noticed about half coming through were families. Now, they were all coming from, virtually every one of them, from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And I found out later why I was seeing so many pregnant young women and young women by themselves with infants. It's because in Honduras, you can rape or murder a woman and not really have to fear going to jail. They don't even investigate many of the crimes. In Honduras, it's called femicide. If you murder a woman, it's the highest rate of femicide in the world. Guatemala, El Salvador, very similar rates. Murder rate is the highest in the world. So I learned really quickly about what they were running from. And there's one woman in particular that I have an image of, and I think of her all the time. And I just remember, if you can remember, I have 2 children, and when I held them for more than 15 minutes, your arm starts getting tired. And she just stood there, and she had this lifeless look on her face that I'll never forget. She was afraid and stressed. All the paint on the walls, all the way down where they were waiting for us to help them get food and get them a change of clothes and all of these things. The paint was peeled off the walls, a freshly painted wall, and they're stressed, anxious. She's holding a baby, and her eyes look sunk. So I made sure every time I passed her that I would pat her on the shoulder and tell her I welcomed her. And I told her that she was safe. And her baby with dark curly hair, I would rub the back of his head and say, "Bonito," beautiful. And you could see every time I walked by her and I did this, the blood would start coming back to her face and the color would return and the expression on her face would change and she had life again. Sister Sally, by the way, from Cincinnati, she goes, "Every time you did that, I wanted to cry." Sister Sally was working with me. There was a moment that I had, and I'll conclude. I was standing in the middle of these sea of people, and for 3 days in a row, we had 750, 500, and 500. The detention centers were being emptied. And I watched this sea of people, and I was shoulder to shoulder with them. And as I watched them, I became overwhelmed with this feeling. Now, I believe, and the Bible teaches, that God dwells inside of me. And if He dwells inside of me, He dwells inside of you. If He dwells inside of you, He dwells inside of each and every one of the people that I was standing there with. And I felt this unity with them that I can't really describe to you. And I felt a love. I felt God looking at us as one, the same but different. Nothing between us. And I'll tell you, Thomas Merton was an author in the 60s and passed away at a relatively early age, but he had a similar experience, and it dawned on me that I had this experience that he had in Louisville. And he said, I'll read to you. In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I was theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness and spurious self-isolation in a special world. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. If only everyone could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are walking around shining like the sun. I love that. Just a couple days ago, Sister Norma's name popped up on my phone, Google alert, and I always pull it up. And she explained it better than I did. She apparently had the same experience. I no longer experience boundaries between myself and others. I feel a connection with everybody. It doesn't matter at what level of society they are. It is as if we have all become one. So I don't know where this path to a simpler lens is going to lead me, but I can tell you the sky is a whole lot bluer. The clouds are magnificent, and the grass is greener, and people are shining like the sun. Thank you.